This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
Someone had once said that it was the hour when God walked in the garden. It was, at any rate, the time when everything begins to breathe again, after the long, hot hours in which life is suspended. Between the setting of the sun and the deepening of the twilight, there is a brief moment when colors take on a strange resonance. The white flowers of the oleander are suddenly luminous. The straw color of sere grasses stands out intensely. The browns and sepias and grays of tree trunks, branches, and stones glow. Leaves, which at noon were flat and one-dimensional, now have a rich depth of greenness. It is as if all the bright light steadily absorbed throughout the day is being radiated back into the evening world. Then, all too quickly, these vibrations fade, as light and color drain from plants and rocks and walls. Overhead, the first faint stars can be seen, though the horizon still shades into pale turquoise. The giving out has become a gathering in, a pause before the life of darkness sets in. It was the time of day, she told him, when she usually walked a little in the garden. "Come and see it before it gets quite dark," she said, and escorted him down the 4 broad stone steps from the terrace, their balustrades still warm to the touch. The lizard steps, she called them. But Robert, feeling his way, wondering whether perhaps all this was not such a good idea, neither heeded this name nor questioned it. When the house was in its heyday, this would have been the hour at which servants started folding back the wooden shutters that had been tightly closed all day against the sun, carried cool drinks out onto the terrace on silver trays. These days, though, the paint was peeling off the shutters, and most of them remained permanently fastened. "It is a large house for just myself," she had told him over the telephone. "We can have a drink on the terrace," she said now, "but I'd like you to see the garden a bit first." Then, as if making polite conversation, "This is an old garden, you know," pointing to knotted trunks thicker than 2 hands could span. "Those bougainvilleas were planted nearly 100 years ago. They do rather need some attention. Their weight is pulling the pergola down." And added, "I can no longer tackle them." Looking at her thin brown forearms and fragile wrists, Robert could see why. Ringless fingers, small bony claws with pale unvarnished nails cut short, rested lightly on his arm for a moment as they turned back toward the house. Should have done it years ago, but never mind. "She is something of a recluse," Anthony had said. "A slight reputation for eccentricity, keeps the gate padlocked. A lot of people would love to see the house and garden, but she rarely lets anyone in. Been living alone there for years. You hear some odd things about her locally. I have a vague idea there was once some dramatic piece of gossip or scandal. Yet people seem to respect her all the same. She's a bit of a grande dame, perhaps, but it might suit you." Chloe had replied promptly to Robert's letter, cool and brisk. "I cannot offer very much in the way of salary, if that is what you're wanting," she declared firmly in confident black ink. "I can offer you bed and board, peace and quiet, hard work, and half the amount that I pay my housekeeper. I could not possibly give you the same amount, or she would be deeply hurt and jealous." The housekeeper did not appear to be overtly hostile, even if somewhat dour. Black-clad and silent, she brought a battered silver tray with a decanter of wine and glasses. Robert fell back on the sort of placating smile and too profuse thanks that are commonly used with other people's unknown servants or strangers whose language you don't speak. The lack of any smile in response made him feel at the same time uncomfortable and annoyed with himself for this discomfort. "She's suspending judgment on you," explained Chloe a few days later. "I sacked your predecessor, you know, and Maria's waiting to see if you'll go the same way." Robert, suddenly sensitive to cross currents of feeling, wondered whether Maria might not perhaps have had some other candidate lined up for the job." "Clever of you," she said when he voiced this thought. Yes, as far as the garden is concerned, she had various lads from the village in mind. "If you decide you want to stay, and I decide I like you, we may very well call on one of them in due course to come and help with some of the heavier work." "I think I should tell you," he had said that first evening, "that I'm not really a gardener. I would not want you to have any illusions. I like plants. I like trying to make things grow, but I have no special training or anything." "I'm not sure that a gardener is quite what I want," she smiled faintly. "Not even the harmless sort in a grubby vest and a battered straw hat. I certainly wouldn't want someone who would prune and trim and cut back and try to impose on this garden. This is where Maria and I differ. She thinks that the garden is a disgraceful jungle and that I need someone to deal with it. What I want is a man about the house, someone who will take care of the garden, come to the dinner table with clean fingernails, and provide me with a modicum of civilized conversation. A sort of sieur de compagnie, if that is the male equivalent of the kind of respectable person who keeps company to elderly ladies." As a job description, this left rather a lot unclarified. Robert sipped his wine and felt unsure. By now, night had fallen. On the faded wall of the house, fat, pinkish-beige geckos of various sizes had come out to hunt the moths drawn by the lamp. Beyond the quiet circle of its light, the garden was dark, still, save for the occasional mysterious rustle, quiet, save for the trilling of crickets. From time to time, the geckos chittered and squeaked. Chloe did not apparently feel the need to say anything further, and it was probably her silence, the strangeness of everything, some sense of tranquility, that made Robert agree to a trial month in spite of himself. "I don't want neatness," she said as he started to work in the garden. "I like it the way it is. I simply want it to be cared for. Minimal tidiness. Yes, all right, paths and hedges. But really what I need is someone who will appreciate the spirit of the place and do precisely what I say." She smiled, as if to take the sting out of the word. "I expect to be obeyed. There are 2 rules in this garden. Nothing is to be done unless I say so. And nothing at all, is ever to be killed. If you have a problem with either of these things, you'd better say so now." Sharp tone reminding Robert he was on probation. "What do you think about it? How does she seem?" asked Anthony when they met for a drink after Robert had been at the villa for a week. "Not sure," was Robert's reply. But he was increasingly beginning to think that he could manage to work for Chloe. Whether she would consider that he measured up to her standards being another matter. Robert possessed a nail brush, but feared that he had never been much of a conversationalist. "You don't have to apologize for existing," Annie had once snapped at him. He began weeding and raking the gravel paths nearest the house. They were more baked earth than gravel. "It's getting a bit thin," he suggested tentatively one morning when Chloe came down into the garden to check on work in progress. "If you wanted to get a load of new gravel, I could spread it for you, and it might stay weed-free longer." "Yes, we could perhaps do that. I'll think about it," she replied. Robert wondered whether that "we" might betoken some acceptance, although his trial month was not yet up. Chloe said, "Wait, there's a spider in your hair. Bend down." He bent obediently. She caught the spider carefully in her 2 cupped hands, then shook it gently out at a safe distance from his rake. "I like carefulness," she said, and sat down on the steps. "What do people call you?" she asked a few minutes later. "Just plain Robert," he replied, and went on working. She watched for a while, then, "I got rid of the German, your predecessor, because he proved to be quite unacceptable," she continued. "I thought he might do because he played the piano, but it was an error of judgment on my part. He wouldn't do at all. He offended 3 times, so he had to go." "Do you play the piano, by the way? I didn't ask." "No," said Robert. "I'm afraid I don't." Not much liking the apologetic tone of this, he added, on what he hoped was a firmer note, If you told me what he did that was so objectionable, I could perhaps avoid the same offenses." "Ah," she said. "Well, yes, perhaps. I'll tell you the 2 lesser crimes anyway. To begin with, he urinated on the box hedges." This was not at all what Robert had been expecting. "Now, of course, I don't mind if you have the odd pee in the garden, but the compost heap would be a better place, or the bare earth if you must, not the box hedges. It scorches them if you do it repeatedly." "And the second thing?" "The second thing," said Chloe, "was sex." She frowned. Robert made polite noises of the "oh dear, I see" kind. "He had a rather crude encounter in the garden with a girl from the village. 6 of one and half a dozen the other, I dare say. Doubtless she'd been hanging round making eyes at him. Very unlikely he was the first. But all the same, I did not like it. He pulled her skirt up and her knickers down, pushed her forward over the parapet of the cistern till the wretched girl's face was almost in the water, and, well, let's not mince words, fucked her rather definitively." This description was even less what Robert had been expecting. He felt more than a little uncomfortable. She noted his expression. "You don't find my choice of language very ladylike, do you? As a matter of fact, I can think of several much cruder terms to describe that act, but I thought I'd spare your blushes, and one might as well be accurate. By the way, if you're wondering how I happen to see them, the answer is binoculars. And though perhaps you may be the kind of decent person who would have averted his eyes as soon as he spotted what was going on, I am definitely not. I watched from beginning to end. Though I must say, from beginning to end did not take more than a couple of minutes. As far as I could see, there wasn't a single word spoken. I did not like it at all. The whole thing had a sort of abruptness and brutality about it, which was horribly wrong." A sudden brief wash of emotion clouded her face. Robert half registered it as sadness. "Oh, I've embarrassed you. Forgive me. But perhaps this is an opportunity to say something a tiny bit impertinent? Your private life is, of course, your own business, but do please steer clear of the village. Get a taxi into town if you feel a business." Robert cleared his throat in even more acute embarrassment. She got up. "I'll leave you now to get on with the gravel." She looked frail and tired. "Lunch in 3/4 of an hour." Robert felt slightly daunted at the thought of further conversations of this kind. At the lunch table, however, they spoke mostly of the common agricultural policy and its effects on traditional farming. "Such a mistake to uproot all those centuries-old olive trees," she declared. "They were planted generations ago," she had said. "They're more like trees now. My hands don't meet around them." Yet the 4 hands spanning the knotted and curving trunk of the bougainvillea met. 2 larger hands, pale and ringless, 2 smaller and browner, a black pearl on one finger, a plain gold band on another. And this is how it began, perhaps. Hands meeting on rough bark, fingers delicately brushing, tentatively, as if by mistake. Then once more, not by mistake. Eyes meeting, nothing said. The sap surging and coursing in a sympathetic jolt to the old, gnarled wood. The morning is a businesslike time to visit the garden. The cool of the evening, just before dusk, is the romantic time. To wander beneath the trees, maybe to show it off to guests. But in the burning midsummer noon hours, the garden is usually left to itself. For this is the dead time, the dangerous time, the silent time, the passionate time, the haunting time, perhaps, when the joins, usually seamless, between this and other worlds strain and shudder for an instant. It is also the primitive time, the hour when small reptiles and insects once more rule the earth as birds and mammals retire to the shade to rest. The silent time is full of noise. The cicadas are remorseless, yet this is not a contradiction. their repetitive, rhythmic, deafening rasping serves only to emphasize the essential quiet. Under the bougainvillea arbor, the shade lies deep and still. In the bright light below, on the stone terracing, an emerald green lizard basks, sunning itself, motionless, save for the faintest pulse in its throat. She points it out to him. "You have petals in your hair," he says, and puts out his hand to pick off the papery magenta and crimson bracts one by one. He places them carefully in the pocket of his shirt. A faint pulse beats in his throat. The smell of his sweat, sharp and green and urgent.
That was Our Lady of the Serpents, written by Petrie Harbouri and read by Susan Hines. This story is an excerpt from the novel Our Lady of the Serpents by Petrie Harbouri, Recital Publishing, 2021. Our Lady of the Serpents was originally published by Bloomsbury, London in 1999. Petrie Harbouri wasn't able to join us today for an interview. Instead, we emailed her Susan's questions and I'll read the responses. It may sound a bit odd, but I don't think that's a cause for concern. Go ahead, Susan.
Thanks, Tom, and welcome, Petrie. I'm delighted you could join us, even though it's by way of Tom's masterful voice. So, let me begin by saying that I found your novel fascinating for a lot of reasons, but particularly because I am a gardener myself. Though I wouldn't say I'm as adamant about my gardening philosophy as Chloe seems to be. But I guess my first question, and probably the obvious question, is, do you have a garden yourself?
I don't have a garden today. After my husband's death, I moved from our big old house with a garden to a tiny house in central Athens, under the northwest side of the Acropolis, where I grow a variety of shrubs and climbers in pots in a diminutive tiled courtyard and on a slightly larger roof terrace. I've loved plants and gardens for as long as I can remember. For the last 25 years, I've edited the quarterly journal of the Mediterranean Garden Society.
Well, editing a quarterly gardening journal is certainly an impressive credential.
Thank you.
But if you did still have your garden, how would you instruct Robert if he happened to come around looking for a job?
If I were hiring Robert, I'd tell him minimal intervention. Get to know the needs of each plant. Never use any pesticides or other chemical products. Learn how to make every drop of water count.
Well, I'd certainly agree with that philosophy, particularly in these times we seem to be living in, especially where the environment is concerned. But on to something else. I was particularly drawn to your intricate and often sensual descriptions of setting. For example, the depictions of the garden at various times of the day not only seem to set the mood and tone of the story, but the garden seemed to function sort of like a character itself, with its own temperament and energy and personality. Your setting descriptions also often seemed intertwined with the emotional states and actions of the characters. Did you set out to do that, or did it sort of unconsciously unfold in your writing?
Both. I knew that the kind of love story I wanted to write should not be a linear account, but rather an interweaving of images. But from there on, the images unfolded by themselves. I write best when I do what I call writing blind. In other words, with only a phrase or an image in mind when I sit down to write. If I sit down each time with a definite idea of what will happen next in the story, I'm usually dissatisfied with it and end up discarding it. The very first thing I typed on my computer was the passage from Genesis about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, so that it was always in front of me on the screen as I wrote. Hence, the very first line of the book refers to the hour when God walked in the garden.
I love the idea of letting the plot and characters sort of, write themselves, as you say. I was also struck by your mastery of so many subjects in this novel. Greek history, mythology, botany, zoology, classics, Latin. How much of this knowledge was gleaned from your own life experience, and how much was the actual result of research?
I didn't do any research for the book apart from checking quotations to make sure that my memory wasn't letting me down. The subjects you mention are simply things in which I've long been interested. I studied ancient Greek and Latin at school and went on to read English and French literature at university. My husband was an accomplished amateur classicist and I learned a lot from him. I also checked everything that I wrote about reptiles with an expert to make sure I hadn't made any howling errors.
I noticed that you've chosen to switch back and forth in time in your story. For example, Chloe's first meeting with Robert in that first chapter is interrupted by that passage about what appeared to be a budding, no pun intended, love affair in the garden. Can you talk a bit about why you chose this approach and what considerations that you kept in mind as you crafted the timeline of your story?
As noted above, I didn't want a linear narrative. I switched between past and present in part to show why Chloe has become a lonely eccentric. Mainly, though, I wanted to contrast the two love affairs of the story, the passionate sexual affair between Chloe and Robin, and the non-sexual, more nebulous, but to me more important, development of love and trust between Chloe and Robert. In both cases, love between an older woman and a younger man.
Yeah, I would say that was very well done in the book. I have to say that I have read the whole novel, and I promise anyone who's listening here, no spoiler alerts about what happens next in the book. But you seem to have an exceptional talent for withholding information until just the right moments. So that in my experience anyway, I found myself constantly waiting to read to the next chapter, which is a true art. For example, that romance scene appeared sort of out of the blue for me. I knew somebody was on the cusp of a love affair, and I assumed the woman was Chloe, though it could have been the girl in the garden with the German, or even Robert and Chloe themselves. How do you decide what to hold back and when to reveal an important plot development? And what would you say is the fine line between narrative tension and confusing or frustrating the reader?
I don't like being spoon-fed as a reader. I expect to engage with a book rather than simply read it passively. Yes, there is a risk of confusing some readers, but I feel that any book repays close reading and picking up hints. For example, in what you call the cusp of a love affair, you are right to assume that the woman is Chloe. The slight hint here is her small brown hands. We've already heard of her thin brown forearms and fragile wrists. The man could not possibly have been the young German, however, for the incident with him and the girl in the garden is clearly stated to be brutal and very brief, with no emotional involvement, whereas the affair that is beginning as the hands brush against each other around the trunk of an old bougainvillea is obviously going to be neither brutal nor brief, and I meant the writing of this passage to convey emotion. I intended more information to become available as the novel progressed, a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. I liked the oblique and subtle, rather than the over-explained black and white.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I'm not a reader who likes to be spoon-fed either. And as the novel progresses, it is quite clear that that love relationship is very skillfully revealed eventually. But let's talk about character for a moment. I find Chloe to be such a study in contrast. I mean, she has a laissez-faire attitude toward the garden, doesn't want neatness, wants minimal tidiness, nothing at all is ever to be killed, and so on. And Anthony eventually reveals a hint of scandal about her, so at first glance, she seems to be more than a bit of a nonconformist. At the same time, she's a strict traditionalist about her own daily routines and about Robert's routines as well. Lunch and dinner must be on time. Robert needs to be clean. Avoid peeing on the box hedges. Take a taxi into town if he wants sex. In her words, she expects to be obeyed. Can you talk a bit about how you create complex characters like Chloe?
I'm afraid I don't know. Chloe simply emerged. I never liked characters who are all good, but prefer those with flaws and foibles. Sometimes it feels as if the characters write themselves, though of course I know in truth that they come out of my own mind. I wrote the last 2 chapters of the book in one sitting. I woke up suddenly at 4 a.m, feeling as if it was the characters who had woken me. Got up, made some coffee, then wrote straight through until I finished the book at 3 p.m. I didn't know quite what would happen in those chapters until I wrote them.
It's amazing how characters can wake us up in the middle of the night, isn't it? Throughout the book, there seems to be an overriding tension between what I would call order and chaos. For example, Chloe prefers more uncultivated gardens to those that are highly planned and organized. And there also seems, to me anyway, to be a similar tension between eccentricity and conformity in the characters of Robert and Chloe that goes against traditional notions of gender and age. I mean, if you want to be a strict traditionalist, going against the norm is more often attributed to young men like Robert and conformity to women of advanced age like Chloe. But in his own words, Robert is just plain Robert. He's often worried about how he'll be perceived and seems to be just fine with conforming to Chloe's rather rigid rules and expectations. Whereas Chloe seems oblivious a lot of the time to whatever Robert or anyone else might think about her rather strange opinions and behaviors. I wouldn't call her unmannerly. She's just, I guess, unruly, which is a trait traditionally associated with males. Did you plan to uproot traditional notions of gender and age in this novel?
No, I didn't set out to uproot traditional notions of gender and age. But of course, such traditional notions are a very poor fit to the multiplicity of human experiences. Why shouldn't an older woman be nonconformist? Why shouldn't a 40-year-old man be essentially timid? As a woman myself, it seemed quite natural to write of a strong, courageous, albeit lonely woman who has put her life together again as best she could after a terrible catastrophe. What interested me most was the way that, with all their faults, Robert and Chloe help each other to grow. The images of thresholds and doors opening are significant.
You're so right about the limits of those stereotypic expectations regarding gender and age. And as a relatively non-conforming older woman myself, I definitely bristle at the idea that women can't be strong or men can't be timid. Of course, that's ridiculous. But let's go on to what I saw as perhaps an underlying theme in the novel, or maybe theme isn't exactly the right word, probably more like a thought that stayed with me as I read the book. These days, when attempts to preserve and protect the environment are constantly under fire, it seems, there's a tension between environmentalists who believe in letting nature be nature and corporate and political interests that are often at odds with protecting endangered species, preserving wilderness, fostering biodiversity, and so on. Do you see your book as an argument for environmentalism? And related to that, what do you think Chloe would say to those CEOs and politicians?
I hadn't thought of the book as an argument for environmentalism, although I'm glad if it is. Perhaps this is because the garden figured in my mind as an image as well as a real garden. What would Chloe say? Open your eyes and stop being such cowardly ostriches.
So, on a final note, is there anything else that you would like for us to know about your book?
Well, the starting point for the garden was a very old garden in Crete, which I'd heard of but never seen. I was told that the owner, a man, never admitted visitors. Antony I perceived as the equivalent of the ancient Greek chorus. He offers, albeit in exaggerated form, public opinion, In other words, what is widely believed about Chloe, though not necessarily true. The book has a semi-classical unity of sorts. The story takes place over a calendar year, also underlining the idea of the cycle of growth. The reptiles and the fact that Robin is a herpetologist emphasize the chthonic dimensions of life, its primitive rootedness. The serpent was, after all, a symbol of wisdom. The references to the classical poets on the one hand and to the Bible and prayer book on the other hand serve to bind the story of Robin, Chloe and Robert into the larger fabric of human feelings over the millennia. The quotation from Meister Eckhart is significant. The more a thing is in common, the nobler and more valuable it is. I have life in common with those things that live.
Well said. How true that is in literature and life.
This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was Pavan for a Dead Princess by Maurice Ravel. This is episode 22081.